Hello everybody, and welcome to part 2 in the series of videos I've put together for a class on April 28th of 2020. When we left off, we were talking about experiments, also referred to as randomized controlled trials. And if you recall, with experiments, what we do is we've got a group of either patients, if we're talking about medicine, or if we want to apply this to policing, we've got a group of hotspots that have been identified. And what we do is, prior to implementing an intervention, we randomly assign those people or places to either a treatment group or a control group. Then we introduce an intervention in the treatment group, and we make comparisons after the intervention to the control group to see whether the treatment was more effective than the control group, which essentially equates to doing nothing. So one of the things you should notice with experiments is that the design has to be put in place prior to the intervention being put in place. In other words, we need to have our treatment and control group identified so we know where to apply the treatment and where not to apply the treatment. Although that's the strongest research design, that's obviously very difficult to do, especially if we think about policing. And in policing, it's very often the case that we've got to do something, right? We want to do something to prevent crime, right? Maybe we've seen an increase in crime and there's political pressure to get something done to bring it down. Because of that, and for a number of other reasons, it's oftentimes difficult to implement experiments in policing. So what we tend to see more often in evaluation research and policing is the use of quasi-experiments. And one of the big difference between quasi-experiments and experiments is that quasi-experiments tend to occur after the fact, or after a treatment has been implemented. And so what we would do, or how a quasi-experiment would work, is we did none of that planning that we talked about with experiments. Rather, we identified locations that we were going to treat with policing intervention. And if we think about this in medical terms, what we would say is we've got a group of patients who are sick with a certain disease, and we gave them treatment X, and we want to see whether treatment X is effective. And what we want to do is do that with a quasi-experiment because we already administered this drug. Or if we apply it to policing, we already administered or put in place the intervention in the field. How a quasi-experiment would work is what we would do is we would try to find individuals or places that were similar to our treatment group. And we would do this after the fact. So what this means is that we might not have perfect or have a perfect comparison or control group, right? Because with randomization, which we do with experiments, we know that this is a group of people who are sick, and because of the randomization, we're confident that there are no major differences between those who were put in the treatment group or control group. Right? They were simply put in this group by chance. With quasi-experiments, we can't guarantee that, right? Because we've already administered the drug to a group of people. So it is possible that the treatment group is going to look a little bit different than our control or comparison group. But nevertheless, we're going to do our best to identify patients for our control condition that are similar to those who got the treatment itself. And this might be a little bit clearer if we use a policing example. And so these are actually slides from my dissertation research. So for my dissertation, what I did was I evaluated a multi-agency collaboration in Philadelphia that was geared toward reducing crime in two high crime locations in North Philadelphia. So on the left here, what we're looking at is one of the locations that was treated with this multi-agency collaboration. Very briefly, what this involved was the police department in Philadelphia partnering with the district attorney's office and probation, parole. And what they did was identify first a high crime neighborhood, which is represented here, and they identified the offenders who were responsible for committing crime in this high crime neighborhood. And these individuals were placed on a list. They were prioritized by both the police and the prosecutor's office, and the goal again is to reduce offending in this geographic location. Right, so this was an intervention that was already put in place, and so it would be impossible by the time I came to it to conduct an experiment, right, because the police and district attorney's office had already started working. And so how I evaluated this program that was called GUNSTAT was through a quasi-experiment. So as I said, if this represents the neighborhood that was targeted during this intervention, what I ended up doing was breaking the city of Philadelphia down to street corners. And so you can think of these, and this really isn't important in terms of what I'm trying to teach you, but you can think of these individual circles as street corners. So these areas represent the geographic locations in the city that are closest to an individual street corner than any other location. And so these are called Thiessen polygons, but again, not too important. In terms of how the design, or how I designed this, what I did was first I looked at street corners that were contained in the areas that the police and district attorney's office were working. And then I used a procedure called propensity score matching to identify other street corners in Philadelphia that looked similar in terms of levels of crime similar to the street corner that actually got the treatment that was contained in this geographic location. All right, so that would be an example of using a quasi-experimental design. Right, so again, street corner is identified in the targeted area, and I matched that to the most similar street corner that was in the city of Philadelphia that was outside of the area that was treated. And so after these two groups are identified, or I should say after this comparison group is identified, what I then did was compared the impact of the intervention at the street corners that were targeted relative to the matched pairs. Right, so that would be an example of a quasi-experiment in policing. So although experiments and quasi-experiments are considered pretty high-quality designs, especially if they're designed well, one of the more common ways that police themselves evaluate whether they're effective is simply through before and after comparisons. So in other words, we have a time period before a certain type of patrol gets put into place. We maybe calculate violent crimes in the 3 months prior to an intervention, and then we calculate the number of violent crimes during our 3-month intervention, and we simply see whether crime went up or down. So an example would be, in this hypothetical example, we've got target areas. We calculated the number of violent crimes that those target areas experienced before we implemented a certain type of patrol. We implemented our intervention, and then we calculated the number of crimes that occurred in the targeted areas during that intervention period, right, when the patrols were in place. And very often a simple comparison is done. And so we could say here, target areas had 325 crimes prior to our patrols. That was reduced to 300 crimes during our patrols. And so we conclude that our intervention reduced violent crime by 25 crimes. Right, and that might seem a simple and straightforward way to design a study, however there's significant flaws with it. And the example I always like to use is, let's say that we put together an intervention and we put it in place at the end of the summer. And so what we did was we calculated the number of violent crimes that occurred in the 3 summer months, right, June, July, August. And then at the end of August, we put in place our patrols. Right? And those patrols lasted September, October, November. And then we made this calculation. Well, if we did it that way, and I always say the best way to demonstrate or cheat and demonstrate that police are being effective is to implement an intervention at the end of the summer, because we know crime goes up in the summer, and then when the summer months end, we tend to see a decline in crime anyway. And so this could be happening just due to chance. Right? These reductions might not be real. And so that really highlights the importance of having some sort of control or comparison area. So if we did in this example, we could look at areas that did not receive these special patrols. Right? These are just areas that just got standard policing. And what we could see is that in these areas there were 300 crimes that occurred during the summer months. That declined down to 250. And so in other words, in this example, doing nothing would have been more effective than implementing our patrols, because crime declined by 25 crimes in the areas that were targeted, but they declined by 50 crimes in the areas that were not targeted. So this is actually an ineffective intervention. We had a sort of backfire effect here. right? But if we're just looking at the before and after design, we might mistakenly conclude that this was effective. Right? So that really highlights the need for a comparison area. And we can think about this in opposite terms as well. Right? So let's say we've got an intervention that we've put into place in the 3 months prior to the intervention. We calculated that there were 275 violent crimes. We put in a special patrol scheme. During that 3-month period, there were 300 crimes that occurred. And so what we conclude is that there was a 25 crime increase during the special patrol period. And so we conclude that this was an ineffective intervention. However, if we look using a comparison or control area, here in this example we see that crimes increase from 250 in the 3 months prior to the patrols up to 350 during the 3 months of the patrols. So we had a 100 crime increase in the areas where nothing was done, in our control areas. And so in fact, the fact that we saw an increase of only 25 crimes means that we can discern that we actually were effective, right? Crime was going up anyway. However, we were able to kind of level out that spike in crime in the areas that were targeted relative to the comparison areas. Right? So kind of an opposite example of the one that I mentioned in the previous slide. But taken together, these hopefully demonstrate two things. Simply measuring crime before and to after an intervention and calculating differences can be extremely misleading. We don't want to do that. So if possible, we want to use a comparison location. And so this is going to end the kind of research methods portion of this week's lecture. So what I'll do is I'll end here, I'll pick up and I'll start discussing the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment that will provide you with a real world example of an experimental research design. And so I'll end this video here, but before I do, I'll give you your second quiz question. And that is, please explain to me why we do not just want to have a before and after comparison. Why do we want to have a comparison or control location? So if you're not clear, you might want to rewind a couple of minutes to go to the previous slide and have a look at why it's important to have a comparison location or a group of comparison locations rather than looking simply at a before and after design. All right, so I'll end this slide here and we'll pick up by discussing the Philadelphia Foot Patrol experiment in the third video. So I'll see you there.